Alright, welcome back to the podcast, everybody, for episode 86, we're going to assume. For anybody new, this is a podcast, so it's primarily just going to be audio. As always, if anybody wants to support me, PayPal and Patreon links are both down in the description below and in the top end comment. So, now, U.S. oil consumption, U.S. oil demand, has entered back up into its normal range. Normal meaning the range it would otherwise be in outside of 2020 circumstances. Normally in present day, U.S. oil consumption is between 20 and 22 million barrels per day. And during the height of the whole 2020 situation, at the most extensive shutdown and travel restriction part back in April, U.S. oil demand dropped down into the range between 13 and 14. And since then, it has recovered back upwards. However, it's kind of stalled for the last couple months between 18 and 19, starting to take more and more steps up over 19 and higher ones each time, and now it has crossed over the 20 threshold back into what would be its normal range outside of the altered circumstances of this year. So U.S. oil consumption has returned to 20.18 million barrels per day. Nearly back to double U.S. oil production, which has held the same as last week at 10.5 million barrels per day, being down around 2 or 2.5 from where it had started the year at, after losing so many active drilling rigs from its drilling rig count, dropping from around 800 all the way down to 250, and only just now climbing back up over 300. The major product numbers composing that 20.18 million barrels per day of consumption: U.S. gasoline consumption coming in at 8.76 million barrels per day, as opposed to normally, under non-2020 circumstances in present day, it's normally between 9 and 10. U.S. diesel fuel consumption hanging out right in its normal range. Normally it's right around 4 with a few decimal points in either direction. This week it came in at 4.05 million barrels per day, and U.S. jet fuel consumption actually hit the highest level it's been at since the shutdowns, getting back up now to 1.33 million barrels per day, though still short of the usual range of between 1.6 and 2 million barrels per day. U.S. propane consumption, as the colder months are now locking in, is staying above 1 million barrels per day equivalent, this week coming in right at 1.3. U.S. crude oil inventories, after previously taking a decent drop, recovered a little bit of that and built back up some this week by about 4.3 million barrels, putting U.S. oil in storage now at 488.7 million barrels versus the 550 excessive number that they had built up to during the initial 2 months of all of this, when there was a serious oversupply issue before all the cuts were implemented and all the production losses from the global drop in active drilling rig counts came about. And just to the north of the U.S., Canada's monthly numbers updated, and theirs is a couple months staggered, so this is their August data. And for August, Canada's gasoline consumption came in at just under their normal range, coming in at 670,000 barrels per day, whereas normally Canada's gasoline consumption is between 700 and 800. Canada's diesel fuel consumption coming in within its normal range at 546,000 barrels per day. Canada's jet fuel demand, which under normal circumstances would be up between 150 and 200,000 barrels per day, still staying decently suppressed, only coming in at 59,000 barrels per day. And down across the Pacific, Australia's monthly data came in a little bit less staggered, so their data is for September. And Australia's gasoline consumption came in at 253,000 barrels per day, in comparison to their normal non-2020 circumstances numbers, which would be between 300 and 350. Like almost everybody else, their diesel fuel consumption was still staying in its normal range through the whole thing, normally between 500 and 600, normally around 500,000 barrels per day. For September, it was 512,000. And Australia's jet fuel demand, which would normally be in the same range as Canada's, is also still suppressed, obviously, because of lack of travel, and only came in at 47,000 barrels per day. India also gives monthly update numbers, and their data is not staggered, so this is their data for just this past month, for October. Their oil demand overall, their total number, jumped back up to 4.2 million barrels per day, still short, obviously, of their 5.5 million that they'd gotten up to before this whole situation started. Their gasoline consumption levels are basically right back near their normal range. They're normally up towards 700,000, and they're getting back up there, currently at 627,000 barrels per day. Their diesel fuel consumption is back up to normal again, coming in at 1.65 million barrels per day. Their jet fuel consumption is normally around 250,000, around 250,000, and it's presently still suppressed but recovering, and came in at 84,000 barrels per day. And their oil consumption for petrochemical synthesis, a lot of which is medicines and medications. A lot of pharmaceutical stuff is made in India. That's obviously never really changed even through this situation, and it's still around its normal area, coming in at 307,000 barrels per day. And over in the natural gas side of things, the weekly U.S. numbers, U.S. natural gas production drops back down under 100 billion cubic feet per day, down to 99.7, and it has been on its terminal decline slope, granted a accelerated terminal decline slope because of the whole rig count collapse. But U.S. natural gas production hit its second, this time shale-driven, peak back in December or January, and that was at about 109 billion cubic feet per day. U.S. natural gas demand for the week came in at 84.4 billion cubic feet per day, as cold temperatures left most of the lower 48 for the majority of this past week. So the individual numbers within that came out as heating demand dropping back down under 20, down to 16.2 billion cubic feet per day, and that number is definitely going to jump back up into the 20s and potentially even up to 30 or over with next week's data, as the cold temperatures have swept back in to the lower 48 states. Demand from natural gas-fired power plants dropping outside of its normal even flatline or baseload range, dropping down to only 24 billion cubic feet per day. U.S. natural gas exports on LNG tankers breaking their record from last week by 0.1, going up to 10.2 billion cubic feet per day of LNG exports. Industrial consumption by industry to, in some parts, make petrochemicals or nat gas chemicals, primarily the two most common types of plastic, polyethylene and polypropylene, as well as a huge chunk being consumed in the nitrogen fixation process to extract nitrogen from the atmosphere. Industrial demand coming in at a flat 22 billion cubic feet per day, and consumption by the pipelines for its own pumping system fuel to move all the natural gas around, coming in at 6.6 billion cubic feet per day. And the U.S. natural gas storage inventory data was delayed, so unfortunately that is not included this time, but we can jump over to Europe. And those inventory numbers did not experience the larger changes that were initially expected, because it did not get as cold for this past week that it was initially expected to get. So the UK's natural gas storage inventories remained about the same at 42 billion cubic feet in storage, just a bit short of their maximum capacity of only 44, which is inevitably going to cause them problems the moment they happen to get a bad winter that's just a little bit worse than the 2018 one, where they dropped all the way down to almost only 5. Poland, where natural gas demand has been going up and up, particularly for heating, as the Polish government has been trying to switch everybody's houses and buildings and businesses over to natural gas heating, because previously so many of the buildings and houses in Poland were using old coal-fired boilers, and Poland remained about the same at about 125 billion cubic feet in storage versus their maximum storage capacity of 130. Germany was the only one to actually see a decline from the previous week, dropping down from the 770s down to 765 billion cubic feet in storage. versus their maximum storage capacity of about 822. And Canada also released their monthly natural gas consumption numbers also for August. So back in August, Canada's natural gas consumption by natural gas-fired power plants was at 6.7 billion cubic feet per day, and heating demand for natural gas in August was obviously low, coming in at 0.9 billion cubic feet per day, and Canada's natural gas exports in August averaged 6.4 billion cubic feet per day. And the prices, as of present, oil prices had climbed up to about $42 per barrel. However, now they've been slipping back down to around $40, and natural gas prices had jumped up back over $3 again, but now have fallen back under $3 again, and are hanging out around it, but as of this particular moment, just under it in the 290s, between $2.90 and $3 per thousand cubic feet. Alright, that's about it for this one, so thank you everybody for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already, and support through PayPal or Patreon if you want, and only if you actually can. May God bless and protect you all, and I will see you all around next time.